Hello, dear participants of Piano Excellence for Life. Today we are starting a new chapter, a new course, and we are talking about technique in great detail. And we are not going to just talk about technique in general, but we are going to look through all technical aspects and technical insights through the eyes of great masters. And we are starting our conversation with one of the greatest masters of all, and it's Frédéric Chopin. What we need to understand about Frédéric Chopin is, besides being a very famous composer, he was one of the first greatest teachers for the piano forte. And again, we need to trace ourselves back to the history of the piano, and we remember that the piano as we know it, a piano forte with pedals and with ability to sustain the sound, was invented in 1728 by Bartolomeo Cristofori, an Italian inventor. And it really took maybe another 70 to 80 years for people to realize that, this could become a profession, right? I could become a pianist, and, this could be my livelihood. And because of that need that was gradually formed in the minds of people that this could be your profession, there was a need of master pedagogues, master teachers. And one of the first greatest pedagogues in piano history was actually Karl Czerny. We're going to talk about him a little bit today. But he was the one who would put piano technique, in a very pure sense of this word, on the pedestal. And Chopin was actually one of the first teachers, first big master teachers, who would say that we cannot divorce technique from the art. And this is why I personally think that we should start this conversation with Chopin and his philosophy and his views on piano technique in general, because it's inseparable from his views on art of piano playing. And as a base for this conversation, I highly recommend you to buy this book and read through it. It's very interesting. It's called Chopin, Pianist and the Teacher. And let me just share a few words on Chopin's life and his musical path. Chopin was born in 1810, and he was born in Poland. From the very early age, he showed signs of musical talent. When he was about 18 years old, he already graduated from Warsaw Conservatory, and he definitely realized that in order for him to keep on growing musically and artistically, he needed to get out of the small country and just kind of face the world. So what is interesting about his path, that it was not a straight path to success. Even though he was enormously talented, and he mostly throughout his entire life performed his own works and promote his own music, but it was not always met by other people with great enthusiasm. So he first goes to Germany, to Berlin, and unfortunately people didn't like his music all that much, so he was not successful. Then he tries his luck in Vienna, in Austria, and same thing. He was very discouraged, and he thought that, people just don't understand his music somehow, don't value, don't appreciate it. And only when he comes to Paris, the luck started to kind of turn into his favor. Although it was not, again, without the bumps, and he was almost at the point when he was given up and almost ready to go back to Poland. And then by just accidental meeting, he was introduced to the highest society of Paris, literally princes and princesses and ambassadors and ministers, and somehow he was part of the circle. And to our luck, but maybe not so much to luck of Chopin, he really had to start teaching because he had to support himself. His family couldn't help him financially, and really he had to support himself and support the lifestyle of, kind of this circle that he was in, and it was very expensive. Apparently he had 7 pairs of silk gloves that he would use. He had to rent a golden coach and coachman to move around to the city, and for all of that he needed to have the money. So this was the primary reason why he started to teach. So when I will be sharing some of his philosophies, specifically on technique today, please keep in mind that Chopin did not teach any children. Most of his students were already adults, and most of them also were quite established musicians, but they already had technical foundation of some sort, and Chopin was there just to sort of help them to progress and broaden their horizons, right, about not just technique but about art in general. And what I personally know about his teaching is that he really did not like and did not enjoy teaching that much, because he wanted to spend most of his time composing. But because of his financial need, he had to do it regardless. Now, let's talk about Chopin's views on piano technique. So he used to say that pianists are blessed because this is one of the not many instruments when we don't have to worry about production of sound, and we don't have to worry about intonation, right? Something that, for example, violinists have such hard time with. We don't have to. Our instrument is already in tune, and it stays in tune, right, as long as we tune the piano. So he used to say, and I quote, that one needs to only study a certain positioning of the hand in relation to the keys to obtain with ease the most beautiful quality of sound, to know how to play long notes and short notes, and to attain unlimited dexterity. So that's pretty much it. In summary, we just have to know what's the good positioning of our hands on the piano, how to play long notes and short notes. It's funny how he simplifies it. And obviously, he just said we need to gain unlimited dexterity, which is not an easy thing to do. And next, I want to share another very important quote of Chopin about piano technique, and it will help us to form this understanding of overall philosophy on music. People have tried all kinds of methods of learning to play the piano, methods that are tedious and useless and have nothing to do with study of this instrument. It's like learning, for example, to walk on one's hands in order to go for a stroll. Eventually, one is no longer able to walk properly on one's feet and not very well on one's hand either. It doesn't teach us how to play music itself, and the type of difficulty we are practicing is not the difficulty encountered in good music, the music of great masters. It's an abstract difficulty, a new genre of acrobatics. So here he talks about the fact that we should never divorce pure technique, right? Pure elements of technique with the actual music. And he constantly talks about music of great masters. To that, I want to say that Chopin's two favorite and only two favorite composers were Johann Sebastian Bach and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Apparently, he did not like Beethoven, and he maybe was not very enthusiastic of the music of his contemporaries either, right? Which is Liszt and Schumann. So Chopin actually points out a really important problem that we're facing in especially 21st century pianism, right? When we feel like in order to become a great pianist, we have to have this flashy technique. And that's okay, right? Because this, again, it's important to bring out the character of the music, but it really, technique should be a servant of art, and that's Chopin's whole philosophy. And this way of thinking about piano technique was actually quite progressive at that time, and it was not a very common thing to do. As I mentioned, Karl Czerny, who was a student of Beethoven and who was a teacher of Franz Liszt, his philosophy to piano technique was completely different. He was actually 20 years older than Chopin. He was born in 1791, but he had much longer life, and he passed away in 1857, and Chopin died in 1849. So Czerny, again, they were kind of working side by side, but having completely different views on technique. Karl Czerny advised his students, and that was part of his philosophy, is that piano technique should be studied separately from music, and we should dedicate ourselves to just play those exercises and sort of improve the mechanics, right, of our finger work, of our work of our hands and all the body parts, completely separately from the music. So for example, when we work on scales and exercises and arpeggios, this is already the purpose, right? This is already the goal, and that's the end. But for Chopin, it was just a starting point, right? And he actually did recommend his students to study scales and arpeggios every single day with obsessive regularity, right? But it was just so they can start applying this and prepare themselves for the music of the great masters, right? So you always had to, it's almost like, one person studies scales, another person studies scales. But Czerny studies scales for the sake of scales. Chopin studies scales with the mindset that he will maybe apply it for a G minor scale at the end of G minor ballade, right? So it's completely different mindset. But it's not only that. When I read the quote about this pure new genre of acrobatics by Chopin that I shared with you earlier, I actually remember my own experience a few years ago at one of the master classes that I attended in the United States. And there was one of my students actually playing, and he was taught by a teacher. Obviously, I cannot name the teacher. And so my student was playing several mazurkas of Chopin, which are very beautiful and expressive pieces. And so the teacher probably did not say anything about the music and the character and what's actually at the core of this piece. And he was purely talking to my students about, okay, here you should move your elbow this way and just move your wrist that way. And he was so focused on that aspect of just physical motion without, without tying it to why it needs to be done in such way, right? What's in the music that provoke this kind of motion. So this connection was never made, and I was waiting for the whole time that he will actually do it at the end, but it was none. To me, actually, this experience was quite a disappointment, and I had to explain to my student that music is not about physical movement, right? It's so much more to that. It's a language, right? Language through which we express our ideas and emotions. So the physical movement should only serve that purpose. And in that regard, I completely share the philosophy of Chopin. Nevertheless, as I mentioned earlier, Chopin did ask his students to play scales and arpeggios every single day, very vigorously, but never divorced it from quality of sound. And he did created his own method, right? We know it as Chopin's method. And today I will share a few glimpses of that method with you. Chopin called technical aspects of music the mechanism. And he said there are only 3 parts to that mechanism. Number 1 is playing scales and trills. And he actually doesn't call, if you read through his method, he doesn't call them scales and trills. He called them playing half notes, like in chromatic scales, or playing half combinations of half notes and whole notes. And that would be a regular scale in all 24 keys. And yes, he did call trills the trills, right? So these kind of exercises. Aspect number 2, notes farther than tone or semitone apart. And that, I had to think about what he mean, right? So these are the intervals. And he says that each finger will occupy the key. And so it makes an arpeggio, right? A diminished arpeggio. And he actually said, you divide the octave by minor thirds. It's interesting that then I started to think, after reading this, I started to think why he just doesn't call it arpeggio, or why he just doesn't say, play diminished arpeggio or something. So he really uses, the idea of, this is more than half tone, this is more than whole tone. It is because, again, it was the technique of playing the piano and the theory of the technique was in such a premature stages of categorizing, right? So the people just didn't have those kind of vocabulary that we have right now, right? It's well established. We know all kinds of arpeggios, right? We know what is inversion, we know what is diminished arpeggio, and so forth. But anyways, so the second element of the mechanism in the words of Chopin is all kinds of arpeggios, right? Root position, inversions, and he talks about diminished arpeggio. So this is actually very important because you see that your hand will be kind of stretched, right? A little bit more open, because every single finger will be stretched a minor third, right? Or in arpeggio, sometimes it's more than that. And it's different from the position that you will use for your scale, where all the fingers are right next to each other in quite a close position. So this one is more open. And finally, the mechanism number 3 is double notes of all sorts. Thirds, right? I have to practice this. And the sixth, playing the scale in 6, or playing the scale in octaves. Obviously, in all the keys. If you think about all these 3 aspects of the technique that mentioned by Chopin, and there are only 3, there is nothing else. We can make a conclusion that the first aspect, when he talks about scales and trills, corresponds to something that we call a small technique, right? Just scale, finger work, right? When the fingers are very close to one another and the hand is almost motionless. Number 2 is arpeggios, right? This corresponds to the movement of our wrist, right? So it's not just finger work, but wrist is playing a major role in when we train for arpeggios. And number 3 is double notes, chords, right? And for this kind of technique, we use more of the upper arm, and that way, all the upper part. And that way, all 3 parts, right, that we normally use in order to play well, are engaged and represented. Entire arm for big technique, the wrist for arpeggios, and the small finger work for the scales. We will pause here and we're going to continue sharing Chopin's method in our next lecture. We will dedicate 2 lectures to Chopin. I just want to say that, from studying this and reading this, even though Chopin constantly talks about not divorcing technique from art, you can tell that even by the way he would describe certain elements and by the way how he would categorize piano technique, right, which actually we use in modern times too, he did think a lot about this aspect, and he did spend a lot of time, talking about it, but it was always under sauce of musical and artistic aspects, and I will talk about that a little bit more in our next lecture.